The mansion stood tall against the night sky, its grand columns looming like sentinels over the estate. Inside, the Walton family celebrated, their voices rising in a symphony of pride and privilege. But outside, just beyond the flames of the lanterns, a different kind of fire was brewing. This is the story of Dinah, a woman who had endured the unthinkable, who had borne the lash and the weight of oppression with patience until one night, she set a plantation ablaze and watched the flames consume her tormentors. Dinah stood by the kitchen window, her eyes reflecting the distant glow of the fire she had set, feeling its heat on her skin even from here. The clock struck midnight, a harsh reminder that the hours of suffering were over. The smell of smoke and pine wafted through the night, masking the bitter taste of iron and fear. Before we step into this fiery rebellion, where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment, and if stories like this ignite something inside you, hit subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been smoldering in the ashes of history for far too long. Dinah was born to the rough hands of fate. On a humid morning in Charleston, South Carolina, under the brutal sun of the early 1800s, she came into this world in a shack at the edge of the Walton estate. Her mother, a strong woman with eyes as hard as the earth she worked, had given Dinah her first lessons in survival, the first lesson being that life would never be kind, that pain was a constant companion, and that strength was the only thing that could protect her. The Walton estate was a plantation that stretched for miles, where the sound of whips cracking in the distance was as familiar as the call of the morning rooster. The estate's beauty hid the cruelty beneath, a beauty built on the blood and sweat of enslaved people like Dinah and her family. Judge Walton, the plantation's master, was a man of power and wealth, a man who wielded his authority like a weapon. His cruel temper was the law on the estate, and no one dared defy him. Dinah's mother had been sold to the Walton estate when Dinah was a child, and though she had been beaten and worked to the bone, she had found a way to endure. The young girl grew up knowing that nothing would be handed to her, that survival was a skill to be honed, a skill to be practiced in the shadows, out of sight. But it wasn't just physical endurance that kept her alive, it was the fire within her. Dinah learned to watch, to observe the world around her, to listen for the subtle shifts in power. And as she grew, that fire burned brighter. When Dinah was just 10 years old, the Walton estate became a place of pain and loss. It was the first time she saw the true brutality of her masters. Her father, a man with a wild streak, had been caught trying to escape, and his punishment was swift and brutal. He was strung up in the middle of the courtyard, left to die under the hot sun, a cruel message to anyone else who might dare to think about freedom. Dinah watched from the shadows of the kitchen, her heart pounding as she saw her father's lifeless body hanging from the tree. It wasn't the first time she had seen a body, but this one was different. The rage that burned in her chest that day was like nothing she had ever known. Her father had been strong, had fought to protect her and her mother, and now he was gone, taken by the very people who had claimed ownership over her life. This was the moment when Dinah's hatred of the Walton family was born. Her mother had tried to shield Dinah from the pain, but there was no escaping the reality of their world. They were property, nothing more. And yet, in the deepest part of Dinah's soul, she knew something else. She knew they were more than that. They were human, and they deserved more than the life they had been given. It was in the kitchen, while kneading dough and scraping pots clean, that Dinah began to quietly plan. She learned the ways of the household, the habits of the masters, the sounds of their steps. She watched them drink and laugh in their opulent house, never once wondering about the lives they had destroyed to get there. But it wasn't just the Walton family who had shaped Dinah. It was the others, the enslaved people who worked alongside her, who had learned to survive not by running away, but by staying quiet, by bearing the pain in silence. They had all learned to be invisible, to disappear into the shadows when the masters walked by, to bow their heads when spoken to. But Dinah wasn't like them. She wasn't willing to disappear anymore. She wasn't willing to bow. By the time Dinah reached her early 20s, the fire inside her had grown. She had learned to read in secret, a skill she had stolen from the Waltons' library. She had learned the art of poisons from an old herb book she found in the kitchen. The quiet whispers from Ruth, the housekeeper, had planted seeds of rebellion in her heart, and Dinah knew it was time for those seeds to take root. The cruelty of the Walton family and the oppressive weight of slavery were all Dinah had ever known. And it was this very cruelty that would fuel her plans. She began to quietly gather the tools she would need to take control of her fate. Her rage turned into something much sharper: revenge. It was no longer enough to simply endure. It was time to make them pay, and Dinah knew exactly how she would do it. The Walton estate was a world of whispers. Behind every closed door, behind every whispered conversation, there was a tale of suffering, of silent resistance, and of the slow, steady buildup of anger. Dinah had learned early on that the world was not what it seemed, that behind every polite smile and elegant dinner party, there was a deep and festering injustice. The Waltons may have owned the estate, but it was the enslaved people who ran it. It was they who kept the wheels of the plantation turning, who made sure the cotton was picked, the crops were harvested, and the fires of the hearth never died. As the years passed, Dinah's understanding of the plantation grew sharper. The estate's massive scale, the sprawling fields that stretched beyond the horizon, had always made it seem like an unassailable fortress. But Dinah had learned its secrets. Every corner, every shadow, every piece of furniture had a story to tell. She knew where the keys to the estate were kept, which windows were left unlocked at night, and how to navigate the plantation without being seen. But Dinah was not the only one who knew the secrets. Ruth, the housekeeper, had been a silent mentor to Dinah, teaching her how to move with the quiet grace of someone who had been invisible for far too long. Ruth had seen the power dynamics play out day after day, and she had been one of the first to notice the quiet fire burning in Dinah's eyes. She too had lived through the hell of slavery, and though her bones were weary and her spirit bent, she knew that freedom was something that had to be earned, often through blood. "Fire starts small, girl," Ruth had told Dinah one day as they worked side by side in the kitchen. "It takes just a spark, a breath of wind. But once it starts, it spreads. You've got to be patient. You've got to wait for the wind to change." Those words echoed in Dinah's mind as she moved through the estate. Ruth had been the first to truly see the anger in her, and that recognition had given Dinah a sense of purpose. She knew now that she was not alone in her hatred of the Waltons, that there were others who felt the same way, though they too had learned to stay silent, to wait for the right moment. But patience was something Dinah had come to understand. She had learned that everything had its time, every action had its consequence, every thought its power. She just had to wait for the moment when she could strike. It wasn't just Ruth who had come to see the potential in Dinah. As Dinah moved quietly through the estate, she began to form connections with other enslaved people. There was Samuel, the blacksmith, whose hands were strong and capable, though the years of work had left him with a permanent limp. He had been the one to teach Dinah how to craft small tools and weapons from the scrap metal left behind by the overseers. He had seen his fair share of cruelty at the hands of the Walton family. His mother had been whipped to death for speaking out of turn. Samuel didn't speak of it much, but Dinah could see the pain in his eyes whenever the Walton family's name was mentioned. Then there was Lila, a young woman who worked in the fields. Her mother had been sold away when she was just a child, and Lila had grown up with the understanding that nothing in this world was hers, not even her own family. She had a fierce spirit, though, and though she had learned to stay quiet for most of her life, Dinah knew that her heart burned with the same anger. Lila would become an ally, a voice in the silence that was slowly growing louder on the estate. Together, they began to share their stories, their pain, their hopes, and as their circle grew, so did their resolve. They spoke in hushed tones at night, gathered in the corners of the estate, plotting the future without the oversight of the Walton family. They knew they couldn't act alone. It would take time, careful planning, and, most importantly, the complete support of the enslaved people who worked the estate. If they were to rise, they would rise together. Dinah spent long hours working with the others, learning how to turn ordinary tools into weapons, how to collect the materials she needed to make the fire that would burn the plantation to the ground. There was a secret spot by the river where Dinah had begun to collect dried wood, dry leaves, and other flammable materials. She stored them carefully in hidden places around the estate, just out of sight. It was slow work, but she knew it was necessary. The fire would come, but it had to be timed perfectly. While Dinah prepared in secret, the Walton family remained blissfully unaware of the revolution brewing beneath their noses. They continued to live in their luxurious world, oblivious to the suffering they had caused, blind to the growing anger in the hearts of those they considered mere property. Dinah's patience paid off as she began to see cracks in their facade, tensions within the family, arguments over money, and the occasional hint of fear in their eyes. They, too, knew something was coming, though they could never have imagined what Dinah had planned. The overseers, too, were becoming increasingly brutal. There was no love lost between Dinah and the men who had been tasked with breaking her spirit. Every blow they struck, every injustice they carried out, was burned into her memory. And while she had once been forced to endure their cruelty, she was no longer willing to suffer in silence. Her body, once bent by their lashings, was now filled with a quiet resolve. She would make them pay, not just for what they had done to her, but for the generations of pain they had inflicted on people who had no choice but to serve them. The fire was coming. Dinah could feel it in her bones, the heat of it building inside her, waiting for the right moment to burst free. The night was humid, the air thick with the smell of earth and sweat as Dinah moved silently through the shadows of the estate. Her steps were light, measured, as she slipped past the rows of magnolia trees and toward the riverbank where the old oak stood, its branches swaying gently in the breeze. This was her quiet sanctuary, a place where she could breathe without the weight of eyes upon her. The land around the Walton estate had always been beautiful. A cruel irony, lush and vibrant, but built on the suffering of those who worked it. Dinah had grown to know every inch of this land, every creaking floorboard, and every whispering leaf. It was a place of pain, but it was also the place where she would rise. Tonight, she was alone, but not lonely. The circle she had begun to form with Ruth, Samuel, Lila, and others was growing stronger. Though they remained cautious, every day they worked together, gathering the tools they would need. But Dinah knew it would not be enough to simply prepare. The time for action was drawing near. She could feel it in her gut, a tightness, a burning that would not subside until the estate was nothing more than a pile of ashes. Dinah crouched by the river, her hands moving swiftly through the underbrush as she gathered the dry leaves and twigs that would fuel the fire. She had spent weeks learning the best materials to use, experimenting in secret to find the right balance between speed and destruction. Tonight, the fire would not be a slow burn, it would be a swift, unforgiving blaze that would tear through the plantation with the same relentless fury that had been building inside her for years. The air was thick with the tension she had created, a pressure that hung over the estate like the calm before a storm. As she worked, Dinah's mind wandered back to the days when she was younger, when the world felt smaller and her dreams felt more distant. She remembered the stories her mother used to tell her about the resistance, about the people who had fought back, the ones who had refused to bow to the injustices they faced. Those stories had always stayed with Dinah, fueling her will to survive, to fight, and to one day strike back. But her mother had died long before she had the chance to teach Dinah how to fight. She had been sold, torn away from her daughter, and the rage that had burned inside Dinah since that day had never gone out. It had only grown. She stood up and looked toward the plantation house, the lights shining through the windows like jewels in the dark. The Waltons were inside, oblivious to the rebellion that was about to erupt in their midst. They were celebrating something, a profitable harvest, perhaps, or another birthday of Judge Walton. To them, it didn't matter. To them, this estate would continue to run as it always had, with the enslaved working in silence, with their heads bowed low, with their backs bent beneath the weight of whips and chains. Dinah had once been one of those people. She had once bowed her head in submission, endured the suffering, and waited for a savior to come. But now, she knew the truth: there would be no savior. She was her own savior, and the time had come to take control. The fire she had set would be her voice, the one she had never been allowed to use. It would speak for the generations that had suffered in silence. The estate that had once been her prison would become her weapon. It would not be enough to just leave, to escape into the night. No, the Walton family had to be made to feel the weight of their actions, to understand the destruction they had wrought in the lives of so many. They had to know what it felt like to lose everything. Dinah's hands shook slightly as she piled the dry wood and leaves together, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. This was not just about revenge. It was about justice. It was about taking back what had been stolen from her and from everyone else who had suffered on this land. The heat inside her grew, her anger and frustration now channeled into one singular purpose. She would not wait any longer. The time had come. She stepped back, glancing around one final time to make sure no one had seen her. Then, with a single motion, she struck the match. The fire caught immediately, the flame leaping to life with the same intensity as the rage in Dinah's chest. It spread quickly, the dry materials feeding the flames, growing higher, louder. She watched for a moment, her heart pounding, her breath coming in short gasps. The estate would burn. The Walton family would burn. Dinah turned and made her way back to the hidden path that led to the slave quarters, her body moving instinctively, as if the land itself knew what had been set in motion. The fire would not be the end, it would be the beginning. It was the spark that would set off a chain of events, a chain that would lead them all to freedom. As she reached the quarters, Dinah felt a sense of calm wash over her. The fire was no longer just a plan, it was reality. It was happening. There was no turning back now. But even as the flames began to spread, Dinah knew that the hardest part was still ahead. The fire would consume the estate, but it would also consume the lives of those who had supported it. The cost of freedom was steep, and Dinah had already paid dearly. But now, she would not be stopped. The estate would burn to the ground, and with it, the Walton family's reign of terror would end. The fire spread quickly, its violent tendrils reaching out, licking the walls of the mansion, racing across the wooden floors. The night had once been still, calm, but now the air was alive with the crackling of flames and the distant screams of the masters as they awoke. Finally realizing what had been set in motion, Dinah stood at the edge of the estate, hidden in the shadows of the trees, her eyes locked on the inferno she had ignited. The flames were her symphony, every crackle, every burst of orange light, a note in the music of her revenge. She had planned for this, prepared for it, but seeing it unfold before her eyes was more satisfying than she could have imagined. From her vantage point, she could see the chaos erupting in the house. The Walton family had been caught in the grip of the fire without warning. Judge Walton, who had prided himself on being untouchable, stood in his nightclothes, shouting for help, his face a twisted mask of disbelief. His wife, Margaret, screamed for the children, but the fire was already too far along. There was no escape. The plantation that had once felt like an inescapable prison for Dinah and the others had become their liberation. Inside the house, panic had set in. The fire had started in the parlor, where the Walton family had been celebrating. They had been so caught up in their wine-soaked festivities that they never noticed the smoke rising from the walls, never noticed the heat building beneath them. By the time the servants had screamed a warning, it was too late. The grand house, built with the sweat and blood of enslaved people, was now devouring itself. The overseers were the first to attempt to take control, barking orders, trying to organize the chaos. But their commands were drowned out by the roar of the fire. The slaves who worked inside the house had already begun to disappear into the night, their escape planned long before the fire started. Dinah had ensured they would have a chance to run. Ruth had told her of the hidden paths, the ones that led to the swamps, to the nearby woods places where they could vanish without a trace. The overseers, too focused on trying to save themselves, had no idea that the enslaved people were already gone. But Dinah had not come here for the overseers. She had come for the Walton family, and now, as she watched the flames grow higher, she knew that her task was almost complete. The house was now a furnace, and the cries of the Walton family rang out, but they were falling on deaf ears. The fire was their punishment, their reckoning for years of cruelty. As the flames climbed higher, the mansion seemed to groan under the heat, its structure creaking as the fire consumed it from the inside out. The ornate furniture, the fine paintings, and the delicate china, all of it was being reduced to ash. Dinah could hear the horses outside, their frantic whinnies mixing with the chaos inside the house. They, too, had been a part of the plan. Dinah had let them loose earlier that evening, knowing that their confusion would add to the chaos. They ran wild through the grounds, their hooves pounding the earth as they raced toward the gates, only to be caught in the fire's path. But it was not just the fire that held Dinah's attention. It was the way the Walton family's world was crumbling, piece by piece. She had seen the estate from the inside, had watched the way the masters used their wealth and power to destroy lives. Now, it was their turn to feel the consequences. She had waited for this moment for so long, had planned every detail with the care of a surgeon preparing for an operation. And now, as the house burned, as the flames consumed everything in their path, she felt a cold satisfaction. The Waltons had lived without consequence for too long. But now, they were being forced to pay. In the distance, Dinah could hear the sound of bells ringing, perhaps a nearby town's alarm, or perhaps the desperate signal of the estate's final moments. But no matter what the bells signaled, it was too late. The Walton family was lost, and Dinah's revenge was complete. Her heart pounded in her chest, not with fear, but with something deeper, something primal satisfaction. This was what they deserved. This was justice. Dinah had made sure the fire would spread throughout the entire mansion, but there was one room, one place she had not forgotten. The master bedroom, where Judge Walton and his wife had slept, where they had built their world of wealth and power. This was where the fire would finish its work. This was the room where Dinah had once been forced to clean the blood-stained sheets. The room where she had listened to the sounds of the Walton family's cruelty as they partook in their decadent lives. It was fitting that this room would be the last to burn. As the fire grew more intense, Dinah's thoughts turned to the future. The fire had been the first step. It had been her message to the Walton family, to the world that had watched as they ruled with impunity. But this was just the beginning. There was still work to be done. The fire would not be enough. The world would need to see the truth of what had happened here tonight. As the Walton mansion crumbled into ash, Dinah turned and began to walk away. The fire was behind her now, the heat fading with each step, but the memories of what she had done would remain with her, etched in her heart, a part of her soul forever. She had set the world ablaze, and in doing so, she had freed herself and everyone else who had suffered at the hands of the Waltons. The dawn was breaking as Dinah moved through the swamp, her heart still pounding from the night's events. The air was thick with humidity, the morning mist clinging to the branches of the cypress trees as if the very earth was still holding on to the remnants of the fire. Behind her, the Walton estate smoldered, its grand house reduced to nothing more than charred timber and ash. The fire had not only consumed the physical structure of the estate, but had also consumed the idea of the Walton family, of their wealth, their power, their dominance over the enslaved. For the first time in years, Dinah felt like the weight of the world had lifted from her shoulders, though the cost of her freedom was just beginning to show itself. She knew what was coming. The bells that had rung during the night were still echoing in her mind, their tolls marking the end of one world and the beginning of another. The fire had been an act of defiance, but it had also been an act of vengeance, a vengeance that would not go unnoticed. News of the Walton family's death would spread quickly, and it would not be long before the authorities arrived, searching for those responsible. Dinah's act of rebellion had not been isolated. It was the spark that would set off a firestorm of fear and paranoia among the enslavers, who would stop at nothing to find the ones who had dared to defy them. But Dinah had no intention of being caught. She had prepared for this moment, just as she had prepared for the fire. She knew the routes to the nearby town, the backwoods paths that led to the swamps, where she would find temporary refuge among those who, like her, were seeking freedom. It was the only place where she could hide, at least for a time. She had spent too many years learning how to stay hidden, how to move in silence, and now that skill would serve her well. She was not alone, however. As she moved through the thick underbrush, she was joined by a small group of enslaved people who had managed to escape the flames of the estate. Ruth had led them, the elderly housekeeper's face marked by the weariness of the journey but determined in her resolve. Samuel, the blacksmith, was with them too, his broad shoulders carrying the weight of the tools he had stolen in preparation for his own escape. Lila, the field worker, followed closely behind, her face still streaked with the soot from the fire, but her eyes alive with the spark of freedom. They had all been part of Dinah's plan, but they were also part of something bigger. The fire had not only freed Dinah, it had freed them all, but freedom came with a price. The authorities would be out in full force now, hunting down anyone associated with the rebellion. Dinah knew that the road ahead would be fraught with danger, but it was the only road they had. "I should have stayed back at the plantation," Samuel said, his voice low, his words heavy with the weight of what they had just done. "I could have done more." Ruth shot him a look, her eyes hard as stone. "Don't say that, Samuel. We all did what we had to do. The fire was your freedom too, but the cost," Samuel muttered. "We left so many behind. The others, the ones who couldn't make it, what happens to them?" Dinah turned her head, her voice steady as she spoke. "We made a choice, Samuel. We did what we could, but we cannot save everyone. We can only save ourselves." Ruth nodded in agreement, her steps sure despite her age. "This is our chance, our only chance. We don't look back." Dinah didn't answer. Her mind was already focused on what came next, the next step in their journey, the next obstacle they would have to overcome. They would have to cross the river to get to the safe houses further north. From there, they would make their way through the Underground Railroad, relying on the connections they had with abolitionists and sympathetic allies. But that path was fraught with danger. They were fugitives now, hunted not just by the Walton family's allies, but by the very system that had enslaved them. They traveled quickly, moving through the dense woods and marshes, staying off the main roads. The heat of the night's fire still lingered in the air, the scent of smoke and ash clinging to their clothes. Dinah's thoughts were never far from the fire, from the moment when she had set the estate ablaze and watched it burn. It had been her moment of reckoning, but now, as she moved through the wilderness with the others, she realized that the fire had only been the beginning. The real fight was ahead. The Walton estate was gone, but its legacy still loomed over them. Dinah knew that those who had survived the fire, the ones who had managed to escape, would be hunted down. Ruth, Samuel, Lila, and the others would have to keep moving, keep fighting for their lives, or they too would fall into the hands of those who would take everything from them again. But even as the road stretched ahead, Dinah couldn't shake the sense that the world had shifted, that the fire she had set had changed something more than just the fate of the Walton family. It had ignited a spark in the enslaved people, a spark of resistance that would spread beyond the plantation. Dinah had been the one to start the fire, but it was the others who would carry the flame. They would continue to move north, continue to fight for their freedom, and in doing so, they would become part of something bigger, a movement, a revolution that would eventually change the world. The fire had given them a chance, but it was up to them to keep it alive. As they neared the river, Dinah looked back one last time at the distant glow of the estate, the fire still smoldering in the distance. She knew it was over, but the road ahead was just beginning. The sun was low in the sky when they reached the river. Dinah stood at the water's edge, her feet sinking slightly into the mud as she looked across the expanse of water stretching before her. The river was wide, the current swift, but it offered the promise of something else: freedom. It had been a long and treacherous journey, but they had made it this far. From here, they would cross into the unknown, into a world that was both safer and more dangerous than anything they had ever known. Behind her, the rest of the group, Ruth, Samuel, Lila, and the others, stood in silence, their faces marked with exhaustion but also with the faint light of hope. They had escaped the flames, but the journey was far from over. The authorities would be looking for them. The rewards for their capture would only grow larger, and there was always the risk of betrayal. Yet, despite the uncertainty, there was an undeniable sense of relief. For the first time in years, they were free to make their own choices. Dinah, though, knew that this freedom came at a steep price. The fire had been a symbol, a battle cry, but it had also been the catalyst for a series of events that no one could undo. The Walton family was gone, but their influence would linger. The estate had been destroyed, but the system of slavery that had built it remained. The fire had been just one strike, one act of rebellion. But the fight for true freedom was far from over. As she looked across the river, Dinah's mind drifted to those who had been left behind, those who had not made it out of the burning estate, those who had been left to face the consequences of their actions. The cost of freedom was heavy, and it weighed on Dinah's heart. "Do you think we'll make it?" Lila's voice broke through her thoughts, soft but laced with uncertainty. Lila was standing beside Dinah, her hand clutching the small bundle of belongings she had managed to bring with her. The young woman's face was smeared with dirt and soot, but her eyes still held the fire of rebellion. Dinah turned to her, offering a small, tired smile. "We don't have a choice, Lila. We make it, or we die trying." Lila nodded, though the uncertainty remained in her eyes. She was young, too young to understand the full weight of what they had done. But Dinah could see the resolve growing in her. Lila had seen the same things Dinah had seen, the brutality, the cruelty, the injustice. She had felt the sting of the whip and the weight of oppression. Now, like Dinah, she was learning what it meant to fight back. The sound of the water lapping against the shore was the only noise as they stood there, the weight of their journey settling over them. Dinah knew that crossing the river would not be easy. They would need to find a boat, and the crossing itself would be dangerous. The river was not just a boundary, it was a marker, the dividing line between the world they had known and the unknown land of freedom. The sound of footsteps behind her made Dinah turn. Ruth was walking toward her, her weathered face etched with lines of age and hardship. Ruth had been the one to guide them through the early days of escape, to help them navigate the treacherous terrain of the plantation. Now, she was the one who offered steady wisdom, the one who had seen too much of the world's cruelty to be shaken by it. "You know, Dinah," Ruth said softly, standing beside her, "this isn't the end. It's the beginning. You've set a fire that will burn for a long time. People will hear about what happened. People will follow your lead." Dinah's brow furrowed slightly as she listened. "I didn't want to become some symbol, Ruth. I didn't want to be remembered for starting a fire." Ruth smiled, a knowing, almost sad smile. "You didn't start the fire, girl. You just gave it a spark. You've given hope to people who didn't think they had any. What you did, what we did, it's going to ripple across these lands, and soon, others will follow." Dinah turned her gaze back to the river, her thoughts lost in the swirling current. She had never thought of herself as a leader, never thought her actions would spark anything bigger than what had happened that night. The fire, the rebellion, it had been personal. It had been for her mother, for everyone who had ever suffered beneath the lash of the Walton family. But now, as Ruth spoke, she understood. The fire had not just been for them. It had been for everyone who had ever lived in the shadow of oppression. It had been for the future. Dinah's heart swelled with a strange, bittersweet feeling. She had avenged her own pain. But now the real work was just beginning. Her legacy wouldn't just be about what she had destroyed, it would be about what others would build in its place. She had ignited a fire, yes, but that fire would burn for others, would burn until the entire system of slavery was reduced to ash. The sound of the river grew louder as the boat came into view. A small, battered craft drifting toward the shore. A man stood in the boat, his silhouette barely visible in the dimming light, but Dinah recognized him immediately. He was a conductor on the Underground Railroad, a man who had helped many before her. He was their ticket to freedom. Dinah turned to the others, her voice steady. "This is it. We cross, and we don't look back." They made their way toward the boat, each step heavy with the knowledge of what they were leaving behind and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. But as they climbed into the boat, Dinah felt a sense of peace settle over her. The fire she had set was not just a spark, it was a flame that would keep burning long after she was gone. The boat drifted into the river, and the Walton estate, now a silhouette in the distance, faded into the night. Dinah didn't look back. She had done what she had to do. The world she had known was gone, and the future, though uncertain, was wide open before her. She was free.